thousands and thousands of years ago, the Seminole Native American tribe. But I really want to get into the teeth of modern Florida conservation. And so I think we're going to start with the outside settlers, the Spaniards. In 1512, they came to America to harvest new resources during the age of exploration started by Christopher Columbus. No matter how I feel about the guy, he really helped spawn a new age of discovery. That's how these guys found Florida. Although they found a lot more nature than they were expecting. The Everglades, teams of wildflowers, palms, they saw things they never expected. That inspired the name. The Spaniards were the one to term the word Florida after, field of flowers. The next person doesn't come until 200 years later, 1797, with William Bertram and his book of travels. The official name of the book was William Bartram Travels Through North and South Carolina, Georgia, East and West Florida, the Cherokee County, which kind of sounds like a wish listing to me, but that didn't exist, and it worked for him, so I guess that's fine. In 1830, we see the Florida population reached 34,000, but was still remaining quite rural for the time, really showing how large the human population was getting as a whole. In 1872, we get good news with Yellowstone opening as the first ever national park. In 1880, 75% of Floridian forests were claimed by human inhabitants, despite the relatively low populations. In 1883, we see an overall rise in women's suffrage, female political activism, and environmental protection. Florida's first women's club, named Green Cove Springs, was started by Miss A.M. Rutledge, combining 18 separate small groups that had existed in Florida at the time. This club sought to improve the town's quality of life and preserve the nature that existed around them. In 1891, we see the Federal Forest Reserve Act enacted, again with that rise of environmental protections that we see slowly built up through the years. In 1895, the Florida Federation of Women's Club was created, and then only 3 years later, in 1898, the Florida Federation of Women's Club was accepted as a state federation. The amount of times I've had to re-record that because it tongue twists me every time is hilarious. The General Federation of Women's Clubs, club women, helped found the Royal Palm Park, which is now known as the Everglades. They also received a grant to help pay the salary of forest rangers across the state. In 1901, we see my favorite president, Theodore Roosevelt, becoming president after William McKinley was assassinated. Good wishes to him. Theodore had a large interest in preserving nature and hunting. Overall, this helped improve the perception of natural conservation in the eyes of men and really helped spur unisex collaboration with conservation efforts, although this also was not a linear progression. In 1909, we see the end of Theodore Roosevelt's presidency. In 1910, we see the formation of the St. Pete Audubon Society, and in 1916, we see the Royal Palm was dedicated to May Jennings, although she committed it to the people of Florida and their future children.
May Jennings garnered the nickname the first woman of Florida, as she held a lot more power than most women did at the time. Being the daughter of a senator and a really strong activist, she knew plenty of tactics to lead her way in.
Alongside the dedication of the Royal Palm, 1916 was also the year the Migratory Bird Treaty was signed with Canada. This led to the act being signed into law 2 years later in 1918. The Migratory Bird Act really focused on protecting birds from potential extinction and habitat loss. This is the most foundational conservationist bird law in American history, but unfortunately it is currently not active, as we will see later in the timeline. The 1920s is one of the most influential economic time periods in United States history, and it is also when women received the right to vote. Although long overdue, being signed into law in the 1919 and becoming an amendment in 1920, women everywhere finally received the right to vote and run for office. In 1926, we see Florida becoming a tourist hotspot already, with 2.1 million visitors and over 750,000 residents. The economy is really hitting its stride, and we see a really big commercialist boom across the nation. In 1926, we also see the National Park Service created, and in
29, we see where the boom left its crater.
Great financial crash of the early 30s. Americans learned in a wounded bewilderment how fleeting a thing is security and how far from the frontier they had come.
See, in the 1920s, they made a lot of iffy financial decisions with stocks, and that led the banks to crash and no one could get their money. And so people became a lot less focused on frivolous laws, as they put it, and more on survival. And this doesn't help with the 1930s Dust Bowl.
The steel plow was the only tool that could break the plains. It had been a country of cattlemen here since the Civil War. This new weapon in the farmer's hands cut the prairie grass aside. The plow and the reaper made wheat the king as the new century dawned. But what was going wrong was that the huge and growing demand for wheat as the United States entered the war in Europe in 1917 meant an excessive unleashing of this new technology in a soil vulnerable both to erosion by the incessant winds and to the frequent droughts of this dry interior. Quite simply, a fragile land was being flogged to death. By 1929, an area the size of England was under wheat. It was a technological revolution, but in 1930, nature struck back. As the years of drought set in and the winds swept the plains as they had always done, the failed crops were not able to fix the soil as the tough prairie grasses once did. A nation watched as the flames blew away. The new technologists were abandoned by their own land. In one black blizzard, 5 million tons of soil took to the air over Wichita, Kansas. Another swept from Montana to the Mississippi. The stories have grown into the Dust Bowl legends of the death of livestock by the thousands, the closing of railroads and schools, the use of snowplows to clear the dust, of cars sandblasted free of paint, and the exodus of 3 million people in defeat. It's now known that had they followed a few simple rules about dressing the soil and plowing the land in relation to the direction of the winds, such destruction could have been avoided.
To try to make up for these losses, in 1935, Florida attempted to industrialize royal palm in the Everglades by draining it and making a canal. Thousands of people rallied against this, including over 7,000 women. One of the major people at this time was Marjorie Carr Harris, an accomplished scientist and massive actor in the conservationist sphere. She was really a big contributor to the fight against the canal over the decades. In the 1940s, the fight against the canal is still the biggest conservationist fight going on, and it really doesn't look in favor of the conservationists.
The Division of Geology urges the construction of the barge canal because of its impact on the stabilization and development of our mineral resources. The canal is designed to cross the state at the most advantageous place, geologically, elevation-wise, and groundwater-wise. It will utilize a series of locks, and the barges will be lifted up by these locks in a series.
I think the Cross-Florida Barge Canal is one of the greatest boondoggles that has ever been perpetrated on the Florida public and the United States public. We need a barge canal across this beautiful state about as much as we need 5 holes in our head. In an age when we have already a great network of highways, superhighways with trucks going along 70 miles an hour, with a jet age coming up, the super jets are going to carry all kinds of freight and everything else. Here we have cut a trench right across the beautiful state, ruin a lot of rivers, change a tremendous amount of the pristine, beautiful environment in order to put barges across Florida when we actually have no need for it.
In 1966, it seemed like all hope of stopping the canal was lost as construction had started in the Everglades. That was until 1969 when the Jetport Pact forced abandonment of jetport construction near the Everglades, giving hope to the canal fighters once again. This was even further reinforced with 1969 being the rise of the hippies, or as most know it as Woodstock. The 1970s brought on an age of counterculture, conservation, music, and activism.
In 1971, we see Florida's biggest employer enter the scene, Walt Disney World. In 1973, we see even Richard Nixon giving into the hippies with the signing of the Endangered Species Act, which is the largest conservationist piece of legislation we have to date. That protects all species on the endangered species list from being hunted. Say that 5 times fast. In 1990, we see the final discontinuation of the Florida Barge Canal. It may have taken 50 years, but at least we've gotten here. In 2000, we have Preservation 2000 enacted in order to protect the same amount of land as developed. That hasn't been followed as closely as it should, but at least it was there, I guess. In 2014, Florida voters approved $23 billion into conservation funding, and in 2016, Trump became president. And basically threw out 100 different environmental acts. In 2017, he repealed the Migratory Bird Act. And in 2024, I don't know where we're going from here. Nothing can be done with the new election coming up. I wish I could give an optimistic outlook to the future. But honestly, I'm scared. With every vote, with every repeal, with every piece of construction, we are changing the future. For better or for worse, we're stuck with it. We may not be able to change everything, but it is up to us to know that we can change something. Keep this in mind as the elections come up in November. And I'm hoping for a better future. Thank you for watching.